Okay. We are here for Faith in Australian Society. It's an elective unit in Wollaston Certificate in Theology, and as you can see on the screen, we're beginning in term 4. So it's me, Mark, and Jenny's over there, and we have a couple of online students, I believe, or someone may walk in and interrupt us, but that's okay. So I'm going to give you an idea of what we're covering today. So first of all, we begin really where the readings from Nonbury and Kavanagh take us, and that is there actually anything that we can call religion? What do we mean when we use the term religion? And in order to interrogate that a little bit, we'll look at what we might call a non-Western approach, and non-Western ideas of what we call religion, or what we like to call religion. So Aboriginal spirituality, I think a lot of people would be comfortable calling a religion. Whether it is one or not is another question. And Islam, and I think a lot of people would say, well, of course Islam's a religion. If we were to look up the statistics, for example, on world religions, whatever that means, we would discover very quickly that Christianity is still in the lead in terms of numbers of Christians in the world at 2.3 billion. It's the only faith that breaks the 2 billion mark. But the next category over, if we look, would be Islam. So we would say, of course, it's a religion. It's right there, can't you see it? And it's hovering just under 2 billion. So it's about 1.9 billion Muslims in the world. So if we clearly mean something when we say Islam is a religion, but what do we mean? So we'll talk a little bit about that. And we'll have a break. And then after the break, we're going to talk about ways that we think about religion today. One way that's very popular, particularly with non-religious people, is functionalism, which very briefly, and I'll say a lot more about it, is the idea that religion, what religion is, or what's important about religion is what it does, what it functions to do. This seems to be, as I say, much more popular with people who don't regard themselves as religious. And then we'll come to your third reading, which was Mary Daly, by way of Karl Marx. So we'll take a look at critical approaches, because some of the critical approaches were really the ones that sort of attacked the functionalist understandings of society and religion and said, hang on a minute, maybe there's more to this than things just running smoothly. Maybe there's actually some conflict going on here. And so Mary Daly in particular, and we'll look at some other feminist approaches to both Islam and Buddhism, were interested in critiquing religion, particularly the patriarchy that they found imbued all of religion. So there's a lot to cover, but we'll get there, I think. So what I've got on the screen at the moment, I will put up as a PDF on Moodle. If you're interested, there is a small collection here at the moment of religion and theology text upstairs. There's a much larger collection at Murdoch still, which we can access through a reciprocal kind of relationship. So if that's something that's of interest to you, Jenny, or to anybody listening online, please let me know. Up until recently, I was a lecturer at Murdoch, but I now will be teaching a much larger version of this unit for the University of Divinity as of next year. And that's the best way to contact me about questions regarding the unit. is email. Who am I? Well, Jenny's met me before. Perhaps some of you have as well. Continuing education coordinator here. My title also includes lecturer in religious studies because I have a PhD in sociology of religion broadly. And I'm now, as of this year, lecturer in religious studies as part of the Trinity College Theological School. So that's the Anglican Diocese of Perth has partnered with Trinity College to join University of Divinity, and that's the way that's happening at the moment. Bachelor of Theology, a PhD in sociology, so quite diverse, I guess. But what I've taught before in this unit, Christian doctrine, probably my Bachelor of Theology was more useful. Today, I can draw more upon, you know, what I discovered in putting together my PhD. So that's good. So this is really more my area. And what am I looking at the moment in terms of research? Pentecostalism, secularism, which we'll talk about in this unit. Secularism quite a bit in modernity, and LGBTIQ people and Q+ people and faith. Okay. I don't know if you can see that very clearly, Jenny, from where you are. Can you see that picture?
The one that looks like a witch.
Yeah, okay. So that's a good place to start, because I was going to say, who do you think that is? So possibly a witch, yes. Any other? I would now turn to another student and ask them, but since you're the only one here, you can have several guesses if you want.
I know something out of Hogwarts.
I often get that. So people are like, is that maybe Dumbledore or something like that?
Yeah.
It's actually a artist's rendition of the Norse Allfather, Odin. And we know this because Odin was often depicted as a traveling old man in a battered old black hat, and particularly was associated with ravens, which in Norse mythology were associated with the pursuit of knowledge. And Odin was particularly obsessed with the pursuit of knowledge. And so, I mean, and there's Norse mythology, Norse culture seems to be very popular at the moment. There's a recently concluded television show called Vikings, which started out really good, became kind of just violence porn, frankly, and ended a bit better. But you know, really got into some of the beliefs of the Norse people, which has become of interest. And I guess this illustrates the fact that for many of us, we think, well, the Norse had their religion and it was very different from Christianity. They had a bunch of different gods, and Christians had one God that they couldn't see and couldn't make images of, and, you know, and so forth. But that kind of begs the question, in the sense that it starts from the point of view that we've already conceded that Christianity and Norse culture or Norse religion are the same kind of thing, they're the same category of thing, something to do with the gods, yeah. Something to do with the spirit, something to do with the divine realm. What we can say is that the divine realm, whatever that means, was accepted as axiomatic. And when I say axiomatic, axiomatic simply means you don't have to question it. It's known. Everybody knows that's true. So it's a belief that you don't. It's your starting point. And when we come to secularism, that'll become important, because we have to understand that for most of human history, everybody believed, not necessarily in the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ or Yahweh, but they believed in gods, or they believed in the spiritual realm or the divine, whatever you want to call it. But is that religion in the way we mean it now? And what do we mean now? If I were to ask you, Jenny, is there a definition of religion that you would hazard?
My guess is, it's a
set of belief systems that vary a bit. I think it plays an element in social control. And that's the best I can do.
That's not bad. I mean, you've covered a lot of the things that we often think about. Belief systems, so something to do with belief, and not just random, but there's a systematization of it. And it has some kind of relationship. Your word is control. I think that's a good one, with society. Yeah. And maybe, you know, maybe that's as far as we can go. Who knows? I mean, we've been talking about this for a really long time. So the sculpture on the screen at the moment is of Cicero. Cicero lived died quite a long time before Christ was born. And he died a bitterly disappointed man, by the way, because he was one of the last defenders of the Roman Republic. So after Cicero came Octavian. Not that Cicero was a ruler of Rome, but he was one of the primary senators. He was a very learned man, a politician, a statesman, a historian, and a lawyer. And as I say, a staunch defender of Roman republicanism, which ended with Julius Caesar primarily, but also with Octavian, who became Caesar Augustus. So the word in Latin that gives us the word religion is religio. And even at the time of Cicero, believe it or not, so well before the birth of Christ, this word is already ancient and kind of vague. So importantly for Cicero, religio meant appropriate reverence expressed towards the gods. And that's to some degree as far as he was prepared to go. He wanted to make a distinction. So he wanted to say that persons who spent whole days in prayer and sacrifice to ensure that their children would outlive them were termed superstitious, from supersteris, a survivor. So he wanted to make a distinction between superstition and religio, supersteris and religio. Those, on the other hand, who carefully reviewed and, so to speak, retraced all the law of ritual were called religious, religio, from religere, to retrace or reread. Hence, superstitious and religious came to be terms of censure and approval, respectively. So, superstition for Cicero is simply, and this probably endures today, simply the idea that we do certain things in order to make the gods or God behave in certain ways. But religion is supposed to be something else. It's supposed to be an act of education where we actually look into, as much as we can, the nature of the gods, what the gods love, and focus on doing and being that. And etymologically, the word religio has the same root, lig, as ligament. So it's something that attaches you back to something. It takes you back to a source. So it looks back to something else. For Cicero, it's very interesting that, and the Romans were eminently practical. So unlike the Greeks, they weren't going to spend a lot of time in thinking. They wanted to get their religio done and get on with their day. So for a Roman, it meant carrying out appropriate ritual. This included sacrifice. And sacrifice, there's a lot to say about sacrifice. John Dunnell, who's a priest in our diocese, has written a wonderful book on sacrifice, and basically argued that sacrifice isn't what we thought it was. So we think about sacrifice as giving up something, but really sacrifice is much more about sharing something with the gods and with our fellow human beings. But anyway, sacrifice was involved. Perhaps This was part of your religio. You would offer something to the gods and partake in a meal with them. Or you might abstain from certain practices, such as sex or foods at appropriate times. And this was your religio. And for Cicero, it's interesting, in a section I didn't quote for you, but he actually says that what separates the Romans, so if we think about what made the Romans, we might come up with, well, what made them great? You might come up with, well, their armies, they conquered all of the world, the known world at the time, their tactics, their passion for the law, their architecture, which still endures today in the Roman roads and some of the ruins that you still see, but not for Cicero. For Cicero, what sets the Romans apart was the correct practice of religio. So they did that right, and that's why they conquered the world. So that means religio is pretty important. And that helps explain why the Christians were persecuted, which they were. There's a number of scholars, my colleague Robert Miles is I think one of them, but Candida Moss, New Testament scholar, who will say that the persecutions have been possibly a little bit overblown. So we talk about Christian persecutions and we think of Gladiator and Russell Crowe, even though Russell Crowe wasn't actually, Russell Crowe's character, Maximus, wasn't a Christian in that film. But we think about lots of persecution in that way. And maybe that didn't happen quite to the extent that we've been led to believe. But certainly it does seem that there was some persecution. And why was that? Well, there's some interesting and seemingly bizarre to our modern understandings, things going on. The Christians, for example, were regarded as atheists by the Romans, which to us seems absurd. How can Christians be atheists? Well, Christians, if you think about it from a first century Roman point of view, are worshipping a God that can't be seen and you can't make an image of. So it's almost like there's no God at all. And there's just one, and that's ridiculous. Everybody knows there's hundreds of gods. I mean, what's this business of one God? This is nonsense. A God you can't see and you worship in these kind of secret ceremonies. But more importantly than that, one of the reasons, so Marcus Aurelius, the famous Stoic emperor, argued that it was necessary to persecute the Christians because they're bad citizens. So if you remember, for Cicero, Romans were Romans because of their practice of religio. It made them great. And here we have a group of people who are not doing their religio right. And so in a city like Rome, which was over 1 million, which is far away the greatest city in terms of population in the world, everybody needs to be kind of pulling together, otherwise the gods will get angry and wreak havoc. And so being part of a civitas, a city, meant you have to do your religio right. And the Christians just weren't doing that. So they needed to be brought into line. And hence they were, to whatever extent, they were persecuted by the Romans for those reasons. They weren't good. They weren't doing their religion. So ironically, Christians were first persecuted. One of the reasons they were first persecuted is because they weren't religious enough. Which is ironic, I think, because the term religion now, and this is something that I think comes through very clearly in Nongbri's reading particularly, is so centered on Christianity. So if we think about religion, chances are we're thinking in terms of Christianity. What I mean by that is we might be thinking about Islam, we might be thinking about Hinduism, we might be thinking about something else. But we're thinking about those things when we use the word religion and thinking, well, what are the things in Christianity that I can say are, so the things that I think of as the important elements of Christianity that are also present in some way in those other kinds of cultures or kinds of faith. So Christianity has become kind of the religion par excellence. Why did that happen? That's a story I don't have time to go into, but of course, the baffling history of how Christianity rises to become the dominant faith in the Roman Empire, and then Europe, and then through conquest or mission, much of the rest of the world. which is a really bizarre and extraordinary story. But through that process, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we come to talk about Islam in a few weeks. But through that process, religion becomes much more synonymous with Christianity, particularly from the medieval era onward. Any questions at this point? No? So there are a number of questions that this raises about that I've already kind of touched on. Whether you can really compare Christianity with other things that we call religions like Islam or Aboriginal spirituality, which are the two examples I'm using today, or Hinduism or Jediism or whatever the other thing, whatever other ones we want to throw up there. Are they the same kind of thing, or are we trying to compare an apple with an orange? Another thing is that we might be doing what we call in philosophy forcing something into a Procrustean bed. This comes from a myth. Procrustes was a innkeeper who had one bed, so he wasn't a very good innkeeper, but he thought he was wonderful. And the reason he thought he was wonderful was because he said, any guest I have fits perfectly into my bed. That's my guarantee. That's the Procrustes guarantee. How did he make good on this guarantee? Well, if you happen to be too long for the bed, Procrustes would come along after you fell asleep and cut off your legs so that you fit in the bed. And if you happen to be too short for the bed, he would tie ropes to you and pull you so you were long enough to fit into the bed. The Procrustes was a really bad innkeeper, and forcing things into a Procrustean bed has become synonymous with this idea that we're actually trying to stretch or cut things in order to make them fit. And that's something I think Nongbre is exploring in his readings. Are we trying to make something fit into a box we call religion, into a bed we call religion, that doesn't really fit? It's not long enough, or it's too long. So we're trying to fit something into what broadly we would call Western conceptions of what religion means. This is from the Chicago scholar Jonathan Z. Smith. He says, religion is not a native category. It's not a first-person term of self-characterization. It's a category imposed from the outside on some aspect of native culture. Native can be a bit pejorative there, but it doesn't have to mean, I mean, we possibly think of native when we think about people running around in skins in a jungle or something like that. But that's not necessarily what Smith means. He just means, as anthropologists look at people in their own society, and those people are native to that society. And what he's basically saying is religion is not something that people use about what they do, generally speaking. Christians might be a little bit different, although there's a lot of Christians who would argue very strongly that Christianity is not even a religion. But if we were to say to somebody in one of the cultures that maybe is floating around in our heads right now, wearing skin somewhere in the jungle, if we were able to make ourselves understood and we said, is what you're doing religion? They might say, well, no, this is something else. This is part of preparing food, or this is part of being a good neighbor, or part of some other part of our society. In other words, religion is something that we impose on something that we observe, rather than something that necessarily emerges from the people doing it themselves. And when does this start to become a thing? Well, it really becomes a word that's used, or a term that's widely used with the so-called discovery of the New World. So before Europeans realized that there was, an Australia and there was North and South America, basically they knew of their own countries, and they knew Asia was there, and they knew China was there, but they had very little contact with China, so and the Far East. And they knew the Turks. So from the 7th century onwards, they knew that the Muslim world was also there. But it was basically easy to look at all of those, and they knew, sorry, that the Jews were present, but the Jews were present in Europe. They were dispossessed group of people living within European city-states. But it was easy to look at all of these people and say, well, these are basically, they're Christians and they're, not very good Christians. There's a bit of an oversimplification, but there's Christians here and there's these Jews and Muslims and they're just failed Christians. So it was easy for them to understand everybody's basically very similar. When they come to seeing some of the very exotic, in European terms, peoples like the Incas, the Aztecs, the Siao, the Comanche, and of course the Aboriginal tribes and the Maori. The Europeans encountered people that were so other, so foreign, that they really needed to go back to more originary categories to think, well, how are we going to understand this? Because we can't understand this in our terms, because there's very little to grab onto here and say, well, this is something that's similar to what we do. And interestingly enough, one of the things they ended up grabbing onto was religion. They said, well, maybe that's what we all have. That's one of the things that makes us all human. We all do religion. So think about it this way, and this is what Nongri is trying to say. An explorer, a colonizer, an anthropologist, they observe a foreign culture, and they attempt to understand what they're seeing, which seems foreign and perhaps inexplicable. And so what one does in that situation is try and think about things in terms of stuff that you do know, and try and say, well, how can I understand this in terms of things that I do already know? And one of the things that you do already know is, I know that we worship God. Maybe they worship something like our God as well. So if you come to India, you might say, well, they have these temples. They're kind of like churches. They do stuff in their temples that might be like us doing things in our churches and our cathedrals. Maybe that's where they're doing their religion. So this is what Nongri calls redescription. We attempt to understand what is happening in our own terms, not the terms of those involved. So remember, if we ask them, they might, and we could make ourselves understood, they might say, well, no, that's not what we're doing. We're not doing religion. We're doing something else. We don't even know what that is, what you're talking about. But here's the thing. If you come to a culture where you don't have, for example, temples as you do in India, or mosques as you do in the Arabian Peninsula or in Indonesia, and you see no buildings like that where people are doing that kind of ritual practice, you might end up concluding, well, there's no religion here. So if you don't see the things you think of as fitting into your square, into your frame of what is religion, whatever that is, a building where people engage in rituals or whatever, you might say, well, there's no religion here. We'll come back to that in a minute. We're no closer to a definition, which is upsetting. Do you know who this person is?
No.
His name, he's an actor, is John Travolta.
Hey, yeah, of course it is.
You have any idea why I've got John Travolta on the screen?
No.
John Travolta is here. This is a screenshot of him performing in Battlefield Earth.
I was going to say, because he actually looks more like one of those blokes you talked about previously. You know, like the Scots Highland people that in the old days went screaming across the fields, smacking people.
Yes. It's got a fair bit of tech going on there as well, though. So Gary Baumer, who actually left us, he died earlier this year, a very prominent Australian sociologist of religion. In his book, Australian Soul, talks about the High Court's test for determining what should be considered a religion. And it's a 4-pronged test. So 1, a belief in something supernatural, some reality beyond that which can be conceived by the senses. Two, that the belief in question, so belief is clearly central, so that relates to the definition you offered earlier, Jane. The belief in question relates to man's, and keep in mind this is 1983, so it's not inclusive language, man's nature and place in the universe and his relationship to things supernatural. Three, as a result of this belief, adherents are required or encouraged to observe particular codes of conduct or engage in particular practices that have supernatural significance. And four, the adherents comprise one or more identifiable groups. And this came up in the 1983 case of the Church of the New Faith versus Commissioner for Payroll Tax. The Church of the New Faith is now known by the name it has everywhere else in the world, which is the Church of Scientology. Of which John Travolta is probably the second most famous member in the world. First being
that little bloke.
Tom Cruise,
That's
that little
him,
bloke,
yeah.
the little bloke. So this case came before their honours in the High Court, specifically because the Church of the New Faith was seeking status as a recognised religion. Now, why might they have done that?
Tax relief?
Yes, precisely so. So they were seeking tax exempt status, which is why the case is before the Commissioner for Payroll, or against the Commissioner for Payroll Tax. And they passed. So their honours subjected them to this four-pronged test. And the Church of the New Faith, now the Church was recognised as religion and became called by its more common name, the Church of Scientology. So is there anything you find striking in this definition? Anything in its inclusion and anything that surprises you by its absence? Sorry, it's on two screens, so it's a bit hard to follow. I'm going through these. You think it's a good definition or a bad definition? Or is it...
Oh, I don't know. It's all a bit above my pay grade. I think the supernatural is interesting.
Yes, it seems to have been a word that people, well, their honours at least, were quite comfortable using in 1983. But that word
because we
comes
don't
up every
like
time.
we don't even use things like the Holy Spirit as supernatural, even if he is a ghost, she is a ghost, it's a ghost.
Yeah, fair enough. Maybe not a word we're very comfortable using anymore. That's what comes up nearly every time I run this unit, is the word that people have some kind of questions about that word supernatural, because we don't really use it anymore. So all attempts to, and their honours, to their credit, were not keen to get involved in defining religion, because I think most of us think that the courts should butt out on this, but they had to because of this particular case. But any attempts to define religion are modern, not ancient and Eurocentric. So they're really focused on Christianity and derivations from Christianity. So defining religion is both really easy and really hard. Do you know who this gentleman is?
No.
This is the man who gives this college its name. This is John Wollaston.
Oh, it is?
So remember what I was saying earlier about if you have this particular frame for what counts as religion, and you come to a place and you see none of those things, then you might actually conclude that there is no religion here. And that's precisely the conclusion that both John Wollaston and Rosendo Salvato came to when they came to Western Australia and perceived the Aboriginal people. They said, there is no religion here. Rosendo Salvato, do you know who that is?
It's New Norcia.
Yes, the founder of New Norcia. And Salvato in particular is very sympathetic to the Aboriginal people and worked, at least he did, worked closely with them. So he wasn't somebody who was regarded them as completely lost. Certainly not non-human, yes, but he just saw no religion because there's no building that could be mistaken for a church. There's apparently no ritual. Yeah. I mean, it seems absurd today. Go ahead.
They do have ritual though, or they did have ritual, whatever. I don't like calling them they, but because they had ceremonies, they had smoking ceremonies, they had you know, boy puberty ceremonies, and still do, actually.
Men's business. It's true. It's true. It's true. And we can look at that today, and often, and we can think about Wollaston and Salvator and think, well, what a ridiculous thing to presume that there's no religion here.
But they had no history of anything else. They come from European places with lots of history.
Well, a particular kind of history.
Yeah. I mean, more like the physical buildings. And
exactly, a built environment with, you know, church buildings, for example, is probably the biggest one. So it's not actually a surprising conclusion to reach, but a lot of people now think about Aboriginal spirituality as being far older, for example, than Christianity, which, you know, probably is in fact the case, depending on what we mean by spirituality. But yeah, these ceremonies that we've referred to, if we were to ask Aboriginal people themselves, and they have been, are these what we would call religion? Sometimes they would say, well, not in that sense. They're associated with particular parts of culture.
Would that culture fit into that four thingy grouping that? Well, it would actually.
Sorry?
That four things that make you a religion that the Scientologists managed to get through, would the Aboriginal, what we call culture, fit into that? And it would.
Yes, I think probably that's the case.
They had codes of conduct, like, you know, they didn't marry within their tribe, they married the tribe over there. And there were more than one group of them.
There certainly was, yeah.
So they probably do fit into that.
Yes, and I think that's the other thing to point out from that four-pronged test is how broad the test actually is. I mean, if you try and think of something that wouldn't fit into it, you might be on a hiding to nothing. This is what I was saying before. So my colleague here, Peregrine Osgood Campbell, who's one of he's the chair of the Anglican Social Responsibilities Commission, puts it, non-Aboriginal people, or Wodjila and Noongar, can know of Aboriginal religious practice, but we cannot know them. It reminds me of an interview that George Negus did, the journalist, with a very nonplussed Bob Marley, the singer. And Negus said, what would I have to do to become Rastafarian? And Bob Marley looked at him like he just said, well, how can I fly to the moon? And he said, well, you would have to be born again. And he didn't mean in necessarily the Christian sense, he meant literally you would have to be born Jamaican. And it has something in common with what Peregrine was talking about there.
That's a fabulous name.
It is.
Sorry. So,
no, it is fabulous. I'm sure you'll be very happy to hear it. So the attempt to know from the outside is what post-colonial scholar Edward Said referred to as Orientalism. So for Said, the Orient is actually, it's not a real thing, it's created, it's constructed, more his word, by the colonizer. So the West constructs the East. So the word for West is the Occident. So the Occident constructs the Orient from a position of power. This is a very famous painting, which you may have seen before, which kind of illustrates some of the things that are going on here. It's the Turkish Bath by Ingrid. And it illustrates some of what happened, and I think Kavanagh expresses some of this quite well. So when the West creates the Orient, it's viewed as the Orient, that is viewed as exotic, illicit, primitive, particularly in the case of Aboriginal people, and dangerous. So here we have this harem with all of these naked, nubile, available women, and how far this is from, I guess, proper Christian culture. Something to be, something that can corrupt, something that can that is illicit, is wrong. So the dangerous other is understood, objectified, and conquered by the civilizing, safe, reasonable. And for Kavanagh, when he talks about it in that reading, the second reading, Myth of Religious Violence, he's not necessarily talking about religion, Christianity versus Islam, but more secularism versus faith. Is particularly true when we think about the way that the American Empire and its allies, which includes Australia, have viewed the Middle East, particularly the Arabian Peninsula, Iraq, the Islamic State in the Levant, as something that needs to be contained, is irrational. And that means that acts of violence upon those entities are reasonable. Because our violence is reasonable, their violence is unreasonable. So what can we say about Islam if we're thinking about it in these terms? Well, this is something that's of particular interest to Said. Said was, I don't have a picture of him, but he's quite obviously of Arabian descent. But he was brought up in the West, and he was a secularist, so he wasn't Islamic himself, but he's very interested and concerned with the way, with how Islam is perceived and indeed constructed by the West. Is Islam a religion? As I started with, I mean, it seems like a stupid question. Of course, it's religion, right? It fits many of the criteria we tend to apply to religion. So these are, on the screen you see before you, is the 5 pillars of Islam, which we want to say, well, this is how we construct what Islam or Muslims believe. There is one God, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. They have a belief in the afterlife, both heaven and hell. So there's a spiritual realm, there's a divine transcendent realm, and they undertake specific practices. So declaration of faith, which I've just said, there's no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. Regular prayer, 5 times a day, almsgiving, fasting in the month of Ramadan, and the pilgrimage or the Hajj. So those are the so-called 5 pillars of Islam. So these are the specific practices. So we look at that and we say, well, you know, that's enough. That gets it over the line. Of course, it's a religion. But my colleague, Dr. Amir Ali, who is a Muslim man and also an academic, says this: Islam means surrender, and Muslim means one who surrenders. Who do they surrender to? To the will of God. And if one does this, one is at peace with the Creator, with oneself, and with other creations. It is therefore not a religion, as in the Western sense, because what Amir is trying to say is that that's it. That's all that's involved. The other stuff is not. It's gravy. But what's really involved is simply surrender.
But isn't that what fundamental Christians believe in the simplest terms?
Possibly. But what he's trying to say, I think, is in Western cultures, we tend to believe that we can make a separation between religion and the rest of society. And if that's true, what Amir is saying there, then there can't possibly be a separation, because one is always being Muslim. One is always doing one's Islam. And yes, I agree with you, Jenny. I think it's a lot of Christians, and perhaps this is why some Christians resist quite strongly the idea that Christianity should be called a religion, because they would say something similar to this, that there is no point in my life where I stop doing Christianity or Islam is more than a religion. It's an incredibly diverse social and cultural phenomenon. It's becoming more and more homogenous. I think that's definitely true because of the creep of Wahhabism, but nevertheless, it's been incredibly diverse since the 7th century.
What's Wahhabism?
Wahhabism, I'll talk about this in a few weeks, but Wahhabism is a particularly conservative form of Islam, takes roots in the Arabian Peninsula in the 18th century. And so when, if I say the word Muslim to you, probably you'll think of somebody forgive me if I'm wrong, but probably somebody in the desert somewhere with some kind of covering that covers most of their body. Probably you'll think of somebody characterized by Wahhab Islam. But of course, Islam is, as I said, very diverse. It's the majority religion in Malaysia. It's the first time I went to Malaysia, and I'm talking as someone who's a religious scholar, so I had no excuse for being this naive. But I was astonished to see, Muslim women wearing mini skirts and heels. But it's incredibly diverse. Saudi Arabia, Albania, and Indonesia. So
the first time I saw and realised about that was in the ladies' toilets in I don't know, one of the places that you stop on the way to Europe.
Sure.
On a plane, and these beautiful girls would have all this, Doc Martens and designer clothes, throw the coat over the top, and
yes,
you never know they were so. Glamorous, actually.
So I think we're ahead of schedule. So is there any questions or any comments?
Nothing I'm not throwing in as going along.
So we can have a break here, or we can just plough through. What would you like to do?
Just keep, unless you need a break.
No,
because you're not well.
No, we'll just finish a bit earlier. All right. So we've failed miserably to define religion in that first session. Sorry about that. We've discovered some of the perils of attempting to define it, but we do mean something. And that's where Nongri at the beginning of his reading says, a judge sort of said, well, I know what obscenity means when I see it. I couldn't describe it for you, but I know it when I see it. And maybe that's as far as many of us can go. I know what religion is. I can't tell you what it is, but I know it when I see it. The thing is, without defining it properly, we end up with meaning. It means whatever we want it to mean, and maybe that's okay. But one of the approaches to religion has become that remains very popular and really started to become popular in the 20th century, and I think remains so, is what we would call the functionalist understanding of religion. Functionalism is basically a defunct form of sociology now. It was very, very popular in the 50s and 60s. And I'll come back to this, but functionalism, the way I think of it, which is probably not very helpful, but the way I think of functionalism is society is like a sphere. It's like this spinning ball, and all of the components fit perfectly in this sphere and keep it spinning. So everything has to function perfectly well and go together in the right way, and everything does its job, and the sphere keeps spinning and moving. Well, actually not moving, just spinning. And if everything does its job, then everything works out. And broadly, that's what functionalism is the idea that in a society, all of the institutions play a role. The church has a particular role, the schools have a particular role, business has a particular role, government has a particular role, and all of the others. And when they work doing what they're supposed to, society functions. Everything works together. This actually comes from quite a long time ago. So from the work of the French sociologist Émile Durkheim, who died in 1917. Durkheim was ethnically Jewish, but like Said, was raised secular. And as we'll discover, was not religious at all, remotely. But he did think of religion as of crucial importance, both in the birth of and development of societies. We'll talk about the birth in a minute. But in terms of the functioning of societies, he thought religion was incredibly important, something that gives society its morality and keeps it together, keeps it from falling apart. Durkheim, he's really at the start of the discipline of sociology. He's not the first, but he's right towards the beginning. And he's one who we call sociology one of the social sciences. And why are they called a science? Well, this was the dream. The dream was that we could have a science of the social, just like you have a science of cells, biology, or you have chemistry, or you have physics. He wanted a science of society that was just as scientific, that could establish laws that could be subject to experiment and predict what would happen. And of course, in this regard, he and many others were bitterly disappointed, because human beings are nowhere near as rational as cells. I mean, we do not behave the same way every single time. But anyway, it was a nice dream. So for him, his cells, if he was a biologist, he'd be looking at cells as a unit of analysis, were social facts. These were the things that he could look at, and these were the basis of his observations and his predictions about what would happen, about the laws that govern the way that we behave. What are the social facts? Religion, class, probably a word we don't use as much anymore, but whether you're middle class, whether you are working class, whether you are upper class or landed class at the time Durkheim was writing. Education, what level of education you had, and social norms. So marriage is a social fact. The good life, what is the good life, which is also contingent upon other social facts. Yes. So this is a rough and ready way of defining what Durkheim was trying to do. Durkheim, so when Durkheim was around, as today, psychology was a very influential discipline. But Durkheim wanted to set apart sociology from psychology. And for him, psychology was something that dealt with what was inside, internal things that affected me as an individual, my presenting past, my family of origin, trauma. These are things that affect me and just me, perhaps. But for Durkheim, what he wants to focus on is the social, the things that are external to me, like religion, class, education, and these affect the way that I live, the way that I act. Then if we analyze these, we might be able to predict the way that I will behave, because these exercise not an internal compulsion, but an external pressure upon us to act in certain ways, in line with our religion, in line with our class, etc. The best example of this approach is in his book, Le Suicide, or Suicide in English. As the name suggests, the book is about suicide rates, and Durkheim studied these numbers very, very closely throughout Europe, particularly in Germany, England, and France. He studied the rates of suicide, and he came up with quite a striking conclusion. He came up with the correlation between religious confession and suicide rates. So he ended up determining that if you were Protestant, you would commit suicide at a particular rate, which was higher than if you were Catholic. In other words, more Protestants in Europe were killing themselves than Catholics, which is a great thing to have discovered, I suppose.
If it is really a discovery.
Go on.
Well, I can think of a few flaws in the way that, you know, like for a start, you wouldn't know of all the people that committed suicide. Some people might have, especially back then, they wouldn't have necessarily opened them all up and checked that they'd taken tablets or not taken tablets or gone to sleep, whatever. So there's that factor.
It's a good point. So there may not have been suicides, there may have been
misdiagnosis or whatever.
Yep.
And the other thing for me is the type of confession in the Protestant church and the Catholic church is quite different.
Yes.
And the calibre of the priest addressing the confession would make a difference as to whether you want to go out and cut your throat afterwards or not.
Yes, and the status of the priest is actually one of the things that he determined was very, very important. So in Catholicism, it was far more clerical. In other words, it was far more priest-centered faith. And so interestingly enough, he determined that in England, suicide rates were considerably lower because and keep in mind he was a Frenchman, and looking at England's society, he thought, well, this Anglicanism business, it looks exactly like Catholicism to me. So he treated the English, the Anglicans, as we would call them, as basically very similar. So he said, in England, they have a very similar priest-centered society, whereas predominantly Protestant societies, the priest is far less important. And a Protestant is far more the author of his or her own faith for that reason, because the priest is not regarded as significant. Protestants tend to put a higher value on individual study, on reading the Bible for themselves, and coming up with their own faith in a way that maybe Catholics rely far more upon priests and on tradition. So Protestantism is less clerical and less traditional, and for that was actually one of the reasons. So he doesn't just want to say that this is true, he wants to know why, in other words, and some of the things that we've talked about actually are starting to go towards the theory of why. So based on all of his data, Durkheim comes up with a four category schema of suicide, why people commit suicide. Egoistic suicide, where social integration is too low and individuals find themselves isolated from each other. So isolation is the primary cause. Altruistic, integration is too high, the opposite. So individuals are lost in the group. Anomic, breakdown. Anomic is, nomos is the word for law in Greek. So anomic is the breakdown of law, the breakdown of morals and norms. And people lose a sense of a big story, a kind of idea that we're all participating in something.
That almost looks like a medical issue.
And fatalistic suicide is excessive regulation. There's no escaping from the meta story except through suicide. So that, as you can probably see, egoistic and anomic on one side of the scale, altruistic and fatalistic on the opposite. And these are ideal types. So he's not saying that all suicides can perfectly cohere to one of these four. He's saying that these are kind of the extreme examples, on the edge, and we can find each suicide and define it from how it's different from these. So based on that, he's arguing that because Protestantism is anti-clerical, it tends to denominationalism. In other words, priests are far less important, and individuals have to be far more involved in authoring their own faith, and there's less tradition to fall back on. Protestantism has a higher rate of egoistic and anomic suicides. There's less there's a breakdown of individualism, and there's less tradition and less story.
He's arguing that the Catholics keep you more controlled.
Yes, more controlled and more part of a community. And less asking the big questions as well, because asking the big questions can be great, but also Durkheim's saying if you don't come up with answers, perhaps this is where you end up.
Why there's the sin. It was a sin, wasn't it? Suicide was a sin.
Well, that was true in both,
Was it?
both Protestantism and Catholicism. So the point of this, showing you all this, is not to say that I think it's true, because I think you've already poked some holes in this approach yourself, and I think a lot of people have since you wrote this. Really, the point is to show you that this is one of the first examples of what we now call functionalism. That is to say, what's important about religion is not whether it's true or not. Durkheim's not interested in whether Jesus rose again on the third day, or whether Gabriel really spoke to Muhammad. Durkheim is interested in what religion does. And for him, certain kinds of religions keep people alive better than others. And that's what's important to him about religion, is its function. So he's also theorizing that, so as I say, for a secularist, he has a very high view of what religion is and what its significance is. He also believed that religion is actually there right at the beginning of society. Society gets kind of started because of what we would now call religion. And he comes to this conclusion. He wrote a book called The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life. And this was based on not his own observations, but observations of others that he compiled and analysed of Australian Aboriginals. And he looked at Aboriginal tribes because he believed that they were the most primitive societies. Primitive obviously is not a word we would use today, but he was saying this is a society in its closest to its original form. So if I wanted to get back to society at the dawn of civilization, at the dawn of time, I can't do it without a time machine. The closest I can do is to go back to a society that's as close to that as possible. So that's why he went into looking at Aboriginal societies. So for Durkheim, when clans come together in big gatherings like corroborees, there's an experience called effervescence, which sounds like something that goes in your drink. And of course it is. It's the bubbles that rise to the top when you open a bottle of champagne or lemonade. But this is also something that he's saying it's a similar kind of experience. It's a feeling of rising, of exaltation that people experience when they come together. But for Durkheim, when people did this, they thought they were mistaken. They thought that this effervescence, this feeling of being lifted up, was something that had come from outside them. And that's what they associated with God. In fact, they started to associate it with the clan totem. So that's a modern take on the totem there. But whatever the totem was, the totem animal, the totem spirit, and they associated that feeling of exaltation with that effervescence, with that particular entity. And so for Durkheim, religion is based on an error. For him, religion is society worshipping itself, but believing that what it's discovering is beyond it, outside it, God, God's spirit, etc. So, so religion is kind of a chicken and egg situation. Religion gives birth to society, yes, but all that religion is the society worshipping itself. So this should make it clear, as I've said, that Durkheim didn't regard religion as true. He didn't care. Like if you're trying to convince him that Jesus died and rose again on the third day, or any of the other central truths to other kinds of things we might call religion, he might say, well, I'm not interested, mate. What I'm interested in is the function or the role of what you're talking about. And remember, the sphere religion keeps things all together and keeps things spinning perfectly well. It provides people a sense of morality that they believe comes from beyond them because it comes from above. It's not something that they thought up themselves. And so that means that they have to stay in line because it's not just human, it's divine. And it gives people a sense of purpose and in that sense stops them from descending into chaos and killing themselves and others. So it's very, very important. And Durkheim, as we'll look at in a few weeks, was also a secularist. He believed religion, in fact, he believed religion would be gone by now, by 2021. He didn't say specifically that day, but he certainly believed that it would be gone by now. But he was not sanguine. He wasn't positive about that. For him, if that happened, if religion was to disappear, secular society would have to find a way to replace it, because that role of safeguarding society's morals, giving society a moral sense, and giving everybody a sense of meaning and purpose was absolutely crucial. Otherwise, society would simply disappear. So, source of morality compels people to live altruistically and enables society itself to function. There's that word. And you will still come across this. I still come across it, and maybe it's something that you've said, or maybe you've heard others say, that this is why people are religious. So I remember I was sitting with a group of friends once, and we were talking about it because I'm a person of faith, and they didn't understand that. You know, what's Mark's problem? And they thought, well, maybe it gives you a sense of comfort, you know. And of course, it would be easy to be insulted by that, and I was, frankly. But the point is that what's the thing that they think about religion is not whether it's true or not. That's of no interest. What's important is it does something, and it functions to do something. The thing is, for people who actually believe or who follow a particular faith, the things that people think religion does or functions to do are probably not much more than a side effect. So for people who actually are people of faith, what's usually very important is that religion, that they believe it's actually true, and anything else is kind of an added bonus or a detriment, frankly. So the point is that functionalist approaches to religion tend to be popular with non-religious people more so than religious people. As I said, functionalism as a form of sociology, not just about religion, but about everything, kind of a theory of everything in terms of society, was very, very popular right up until the early 70s. And then theorists were starting to wonder how, so you've got a spinning ball and everything works really well, but how do you change anything in that system? How does anything get shifted? How does anything move? Everything's very static. And they actually returned to someone who was writing before Durkheim to try and explain this. They turned to the conflict theories espoused by Karl Marx. Karl Marx was born in Prussia, lived most of his life in London, and as you're probably aware, is regarded as the father of communism and socialism. And rather, as Durkheim theorized that all this, not just Durkheim, but those who followed, like Talcott, Parsons, theorized that society has all of these parts that fit together and make it work. What Marx theorized was that actually what's going on in society is conflict all of the time, and that's what drives things forward. So this is actually a theory that's based on motion, not on everything working together and staying still, but everything changing all of the time as the two sides are fighting each other. And the two sides for Marx are the capitalists and the proletariat. So in other words, for Marx, these two classes, the capitalists being those who own the means of production, and the proletariat being those who don't and therefore have to sell their labour. These are the two sides of this never-ending conflict that drives society forward. So what does this guy think of religion? Well, probably if you know anything about Marx's view of religion, you know that he didn't like it very much.
Well, he actually, his view seemed to be the same view as the function. It's a functionist view.
Yes, he certainly didn't think it was true.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that it controls. You know.
That's very important for Marx, yes. So this is, if you've heard anything from Marx about religion, you've heard this. Religious suffering is one at the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. It's a sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. He's writing at the time of the Opium Wars in China as well. It's quite significant. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions. So for Marx, religion is voicing real suffering, but it's actually based on an illusion. And if people could put aside that illusion and just sit with the fact that they are suffering, they would decide, I don't want to live like this anymore. I want to change the world. But religion, as you said, helps control people and leads them to believe that their suffering has a purpose and that it is divinely mandated, rather than compelling them to actually mobilize and change their conditions. The reason this is important today, obviously, critical theory has really brought an end to functionalist approaches to society, but interestingly enough, not to functionalist approaches to religion, which are still very popular. But one of the reasons it's important today is because your last reading that I gave you was from Mary Daly. And feminist critiques of religion actually draw a lot on Marxian thought, but they replace the central conflict between the classes as a conflict between the sexes, and replace the class conflict with patriarchy. So the systematic marginalization and exploitation of women. So for feminist critics of religion, religion conceals or masks patriarchy and has enabled both women and men to accept and promote patriarchy as divinely mandated. This is particularly the approach of the late Mary Daly. Mary Daly started out as a Catholic scholar and theologian, but she ended up teaching as a feminist philosopher. She was controversial because at Boston College, because she had some courses that she would not permit men to take. So she only had women in the class, which became a problem.
Men would be taught the same stuff, technically.
Well, they could be. So she always offered to privately tutor men, but she wanted women to be able to have classes where they could be free of men. But in the end, it meant that her position at Boston College became untenable.
Yeah. Actually, and reading in that, what you described as that ball all fitting together to keep things balanced, I think, although I've understood it in my own head anyway, I think it came out of that reading, I'm not sure, how if it's difficult to move on or change, because if you change one thing, it upsets the balance of other things, regardless of whether you want to take power off the men or whatever. Even if you want to do it in a way that doesn't take anything away from them, it automatically does, because the balance of the things change.
Yeah. So if you think about it in terms of zero sum, if one person has this much power, one person has this much, and this person decides to take it, has to go. Yes, precisely so. And that spinning ball has no way, like if someone's, as you say, if someone says,
well, I don't want to be this thing anymore. I want to be this thing. Everything gets thrown out. So there's no room for change in the functionalist schema, which is why the conflict theories started to become much more popular. And in terms of change, Daly's thought changed. So she began a particular place, the Church in the Second Sex, where she was hoping to reform Catholicism, particularly the sexism in Catholicism. But beyond God the Father, she moves more to a view that men and women are different, and female autonomy is more important than equality, which is a very important shift. It's no longer talking about egalitarianism between the genders, but actually to say women need to have autonomy, be able to make their own decisions and decide and rule, in a sense, themselves. The long quote, which is actually in the reading, so I won't go through that, but it is all about the very sexist history of theology, and frankly, I think she's absolutely right. So Daly published The Church and the Second Sex in 1968, and she argued that the Judeo-Christian tradition, whatever that means, is deeply misogynistic and has supported the marginalisation of women throughout history. And there's certainly, as I say, I'll give these notes to you, and you can have a look at the graphic if it's a bit hard to see, but there's a number of texts on the screen which certainly have been used and frankly in their plain common sense meaning are misogynistic. I don't see another way to read them. Daly turns the equal but different rhetoric on its head. So this is a complementarian idea, the idea that men and women have different roles. Men have roles in the public sphere, they lead, they exercise governance, they work outside the home. Women have a role in the private sphere, in the home, they raise children, they nurture, etc. Which is a very popular view, particularly in Catholicism, but other forms of religion as well. She turns it on its head because she still wants to maintain that women are indeed different, but she's also arguing that this equal but different rhetoric has been used to silence and marginalize women. And it assumes that the starting point for equality should be determined by male standards. So you're on a hiding to nothing right from the beginning. She eventually, in her later work, came to the position that women were not equal, but actually superior to men. And asserting this would be the only way to finally demolish patriarchy. And in the end, she did turn it back on the church. So there's a number of Christian feminist theologians who remained within Christianity. Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, for example, who believed that Christianity could be transformed by feminism, by feminist theology. Daly, in the end, did not take that view. She came to the position that Christianity was irredeemably patriarchal. But she certainly didn't think, and that reading, I think, demonstrates this, that this was simply confined to religion. So she thought psychology was also very, very patriarchal and marginalizing of women's experience. Any questions about Mary Daly? Comments? So there are feminist critiques of religion in both Islam and Buddhism, and so these are two of some of the more prominent scholars in that regard. Amina Wadud is still with us. Rita Gross died in 2016. Amina Wadud is a Muslim scholar, and Rita Gross was a Buddhist practitioner and scholar. And both have sought ways to combine their own feminist critiques and thinking with their practice of their faith. So unlike Daly, they did not turn their back on their faiths. They sought to continue transforming, I guess, from the inside, you might say. this is what Wadud has to say about the Quran. There's no indication that the Quran intends for us to understand that there's a primordial, in other words, essential distinction between males and females with regards to spiritual potential. There's no idea in the Quran that men and women can't do the same, can't achieve the same things spiritually. Otherwise, free will would be meaningless because everything would be predetermined. It's interesting to note that even those Muslim authors who issue interpretations accept that the Quran aims to establish social justice, but social justice ain't social justice. It's obvious that their interpretations of social justice do not fully extend to women. And the analogy being Thomas Jefferson and the writers of the American Constitution saying all men are created equal without intending in the least to include equality between black men and white men, which is a very powerful analogy. So the argument is that there are many scholars of Islam who want to say that all people are created equal, but they don't include women in people. And she wants to take a blowtorch to that. So importantly
I haven't read the Quran or one bits of it, but I have not as a book. But when you were reading that, I was wondering, like our Bible's full of patriarchal stuff.
Agreed.
Whereas nothing I've seen in the Quran seems to be gender specific. Is that because I haven't read enough of it? Or?
There's quite a bit that is.
I mean, considering the way
I would call patriarchal, yeah.
Some of them, not the fundamentalist parts, treat their women more overtly as lesser or discriminated against than, you know, us Christian men are much more subtle about it.
That's fair.
But I haven't, as I say, I haven't read a lot of it, but I haven't read any.
There is, I would say there's patriarchy in there. I mean, I think I would take a different view from Wadud. Wadud is saying, and this actually relates to what you're talking about, that patriarchy is not part of the Quran. Patriarchy comes in at the interpretive level. Yeah. So when people read it and apply it. So she would say, yes, she would agree with you. I think that's not a view that I think I can take, having read quite a lot, most of the Quran. I think there's a fair bit of patriarchy in there. But anyway, I think that's, so it's a powerful view because it means she can remain within Islam and critique interpretations of the Quran that she regards as patriarchal. Rita Gross had a different problem because Buddhism has been very resistant to feminist critique because gender is not a thing in Buddhism. There's no male or female, but patriarchy is very real and it gets concealed. And Gross tells the story of when she was starting to talk about feminism and its possible critique of Buddhism. And she came across these very nonplussed Japanese Buddhists who said to her, well, here's the problem. You're saying that Buddhism is patriarchal and that women need to be, to have a greater role. There needs to be more equality in Buddhism. Really, what you should be recognizing is that if you live a good Buddhist life, you'll be reincarnated as a man, so there'll be no problem. And if you think about it, that is an ironclad defense against patriarchy. And it's very difficult to argue against, but Gross found a way. And she did it through the story of Tara. Tara was an enlightened being, which is the goal of Buddhists. Tara was at one time a human being engaging in the same meditation practices we do, but after much practice, she finally experienced awakened mind. She became enlightened. The monks around her suggested that she could and should now take on a male rebirth. Instead of doing so, she told them, in this life, there is no distinction. as male. There's no such distinction as male and female. Attachment to ideas of male and female is quite worthless. Weak-minded worldlings are always deluded by this. So in this way, Gross is able to spin the critique and say, well, you people who say we should be reincarnated as men are weak-minded worldlings. What we really need to do is focus on this life and not focus on the fact that it's better to be a man and we'll come back as men and that'll be awesome. But rather, how can we achieve true enlightenment in every sense that means? So, some scholars of religion bringing the critical tools of Marxian and feminist theory to bear in order to reform religion. Others see that only the end of religion will do, and Marx was certainly one of those, as Mary Daly became also, because religion is irredeemably exploitative. Is religion irredeemably sexist? Daly said yes. Gross and Wood seem to be arguing no. Is it possible to be religious, modern and feminist? What do you think?
Well, obviously, I think it is, depending on the interpretation of religious there, because we still haven't got to the fact of what religious actually means.
Yes, well said.
But having said that, I think at this point in the lifespan of the world, women have got to a point where we don't even see the misogynistic, like we're just so used to it. We don't take any notice of it necessarily, like it, because it's just always been there.
I see.
So it doesn't necessarily have the power on the individual, but it still maintains power in the structures and the scheme of things. So it depends where any individual, male or female, is. I mean, because it is pretty amazing. The one on the end looks like a nun, if that's not just long hair.
Yes, it is. I think it's supposed to be a nun.
Like the fact that there are so many women that took religion that seriously, especially in a religion where women have had no sense of equality at all.
Yes. And that's true in Christianity, historically with Catholicism, Protestantism, but also true in Buddhism. There's many long tradition of nuns in Buddhism, and interestingly enough, some of the feminist critiques being brought to bear even on Buddhism are starting to, because Buddhism has a lot of purchase in the Western world, possibly more so than some of the other Eastern religions. There's a lot of interplay between some modern feminist thought and Eastern thinking in Buddhism. So people like Rita Gross and others are starting to have some effect in some ways. All right, well, that is...
Well done, Mark.
So the handout I've given you it'd be well known to you, Jenny, everything on it, but it's just a refresher about the difference. So, I mean, Durkheim's theory assumes that we know the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism. So if that's, I've given you that just as a refresher. Peter Elliott covered that at length in his unit. Okay, so I will put this video up, and maybe next week we might ask our fellow students to join us via Zoom if they want.
Oh, that'd be good. That's me there, the only one in the room, so.
Yeah, you can't see Jenny, but she is waving at you. So
Oh.
We hope to see you next week. I don't know why the camera's supposed to follow you. I don't know why it's not. Anyway, all right. So thank you, and we will see you next week.
Yeah.